Yeah, do you want to?
No, you guys, TV. I thought we would do TV.
I
Then.
think you can just hit the thermostat over there to turn off the air.
Oh, I wasn't sure. Should we shut that off? Scott, should we shut off the thermostat? Can he hear us?
I don't think so.
No, he can only hear you, because you're the only one. Hey, no. I'm guessing the thermostat.
Sorry. Okay. Once we do this,
I like the green for Earth Day, by the way.
Yep, I was thinking.
All right, you can begin.
And it's close. Okay, first question. What inspired you to become an advocate for sustainability?
Well, I've never really considered myself an advocate for sustainability. I consider myself a climate change activist, and in a lot of ways a social justice activist. For me, it's not about like the narrow frame of where the environmental issues have normally been put, but the broader issues of the interconnected injustices that we face, a lot of which are manifesting in climate change, and which climate change is in turn going to make a lot worse. So for me, I look at that from the system change that is necessary there, because I really see it as a systemic injustice, that it's a failure of a broken democracy that got us into this position, and it'll take a genuinely systemic revolution to get us out of it. I think we need a political revolution, we need an energy revolution, an economic revolution, and a social revolution. And I don't think we can really detach one from the other. I think they all have to go hand in hand.
I'm gonna jump ahead a little bit here, but how did you feel when you were being removed from the auction?
Well, I mean that in some ways it was a very intense situation. Where I knew that it was the beginning of some big consequences that I'd be dealing with from that, and that I'd suddenly stepped into a very controversial position. But on the other hand, I was feeling really relaxed and peaceful, and fulfilled at that time, because after I had just disrupted that auction, it was really the first time that I felt like my actions were really in line with my sentiment about climate change. That up to that point, I'd been pretty focused on climate change, and certainly had the sentiment that this is the biggest crisis that our civilization has ever faced. But my response to it was, by and large, changing my consumer habits and biking and signing petitions and stuff like that, like all stuff that I knew was nowhere near the scale of the crisis. And so I think that had created a lot of internal turmoil for me. And so at that point, once I had jumped all in, and really put myself on the line to stand in the way of this injustice, it felt really good, that a lot of that turmoil was gone. So internally, I really felt relaxed at the same time that my mind was racing about the next steps that I needed to be doing at that point.
So you say that you're very much an advocate for the larger scale issues, and that it's like a really big issue with oil and all that kind of stuff, and that the consumer habits is a good thing to change, but it's not going to address the whole issue. What kind of advice would you give to people like us, college students and young people who may not have the resources to perform such large scale uprisings, such as like infiltrating an auction like that, other than changing our consumer habits?
Well, I don't think it necessarily takes resources to do it. I mean, I didn't have any resources at that time. I didn't have any support. All that came afterwards. I was just one person acting alone. I think the important thing is to realize the institutions that we're a part of, and realize the other roles in which we have power. And we're taught to think as consumers, and to look for the ways that we can have an impact with our consumer habits. But you're also university students that can influence that institution. We're seeing a lot of that around the country with the campaigns to divest endowments from fossil fuels. That's a kind of shift from just consumer thinking to thinking as part of an interconnected web, which I think is a lot more powerful. Of people looking at those structures of power and looking at what connections they have to the institutions or players within that structure, and what they can do to influence those institutions that they're connected to. I think a lot of people get disempowered trying to work on the big issues because they look at some decision maker like the president or Congress or some CEO, and they try to petition that person or call that person or whatever, and that person doesn't care what you think. You have no influence over that person, and so you get dismissed, and that seems disempowering. But that person in power is not isolated, and you are not an isolated individual. You're each connected to this bigger web, and when you leverage those connections that you have and start to realize the power that comes from the communities that you're a part of, which might be very small local communities, a little grassroots group where you're one of like 5 people where you have a big influence over that little group, or the larger communities that you're a part of, in your cities or whatever, where you might be one of like 10,000. So you have you can't control that quite as well as you can your little group, but then you have once you start to shift those bigger communities, then they have a lot more leverage to then shift the bigger picture that they're a part of. So I think recognizing those connections is a really big part of finding where our power lies.
Can you tell us a little bit about your experience in prison? What was that like? Was it worth it? I don't know if it's too...
Yeah, it was totally worth it. My experience in prison was it was frustrating in a lot of ways. It was boring and tedious, but it certainly wasn't horrible. My day was made up of I'd walk the track for an hour in the morning. I'd read for a while. I'd work out. I'd talk to some people. I worked in the kitchen chopping vegetables, so I'd do that in the afternoon. Then I'd read some more and walk the track and sit around and talk with people. One of the consequences of mass incarceration that we rarely think about is that our prisons are now filled with normal people. We have an order of magnitude more people in prison now than we did a generation ago. And that hasn't happened because of some radical shift in human nature. That's happened because of the influence of the private prison industry lobbying to change the laws that allow us to lock up normal people for much longer times. And so, one of the consequences of that really unjust system that's going on in our justice system is that prisons are full of normal people. And so the people I met there were, pretty similar to the kind of people that I've met just about everywhere else that I've been in my life. I made friendships with people there. I had good conversations with people there. In a lot of ways, people in prison had more ownership over their society, over the part of it that they could control. And so they were very intentional and conscious about creating the kind of community that they wanted to have in their little world. So there was a huge effort to welcome people and to bring them in to that society, so that there were a lot of things that I learned in that experience. It certainly deepened my understanding of a lot of social justice issues, because it was 2 years that I spent with one of the most disempowered groups of people in our society, people who are not only oppressed in their current situation, but by and large got into that situation because they were disenfranchised or disempowered in one way or another. So just being in a community like that for 2 years deepened my understanding of a lot of racial issues and poverty issues and things like that.
You mentioned earlier that you consider yourself a social justice advocate, and that you, or activist rather, and that you have been exposed to social justice. So before entering prison, were you aware of the mass incarceration issues? And if you were, did that kind of like lessen your fear of going to prison or the anxiety?
Yes, I was aware, and no, it didn't lessen it. You know, I'd
I
read.
meant more like you
Yeah.
knew that you weren't going to meet with like these crazy killers like with tattoos.
Well, you know, I'd intellectually, I understood a lot of these issues. You know, I'd read stuff like the New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander. You know, so I had that kind of understanding of what's been changing in our justice system. Justice system where everybody who goes to prison is this psychopathic murderer and rapist, and you know, with every case they pore over all the details, and you know, all the people working in that system, prosecutors and cops, they all really care about justice, and they, you know, cross all their T's and dot all their I's and make sure they're doing the right thing, and they like reflect on things in a deep way. I mean, that's all completely nonsense. And has no basis whatsoever in reality. And you know, and I think those kind of images were why I was afraid of prison going into it, because that's the kind of culture that I'd been indoctrinated into. All these sort of subtle images, you know, that weren't like, you know, a book where you're sitting down and reading facts and figures, but just the subtle stuff that's on TV and in the way that they talk about things on the news and things like that, that really shapes our deeper perspectives on things that we're not even conscious about.
Yeah, and social justice activists often say, like, you know, people slip up. You could be the biggest social justice activist ever, but like we're so indoctrinated in our culture that like we believe certain stereotypes about, you know, races, minorities, even like gender roles,
Mhm.
that sometimes people think of something and it's just in their brain, and you can study it and you can preach it as much as you can, but at the end of the day, those stereotypes are still like embedded in you.
Yeah, yeah, and you know, and I think that's why actually connecting with different communities is so important, because I think it's through relationships with real people that we challenge those stereotypes, and we challenge that unconscious bias that our culture really feeds us all the time, and constantly is building up within us. We have to constantly try to decolonize our minds in that way by continually connecting with people on a human level.
I'll ask one more so everyone can get to their questions. Can you tell us a little bit about Peaceful Uprising? Is it still a work in progress? Has it met your goals?
Well, I think Peaceful Uprising will always be a work in progress. You know, and it was created to be a constant work in progress. We started Peaceful Uprising with the understanding that what the climate movement was doing was not working, and that we were failing to address this crisis. And yet we didn't claim to know exactly what it was going to take. You know, we realized that this was an unprecedented situation, and that we didn't necessarily have the right answers. And so it was started as an experimental group. And so it's changed very drastically several times over the years. We've experimented with different kinds of structures, different kinds of funding, different kinds of campaigns, and it continues to do that. You know, and so it's shifted quite a bit since I was heavily involved before I went to prison. You know, since then I haven't really been involved in the day-to-day organization, but they've continued to challenge themselves, and continued to try to confront the shifting challenge of the climate crisis. And so it's certainly had some success in shifting things in the climate movement. You know, the embrace of civil disobedience in the climate movement is a dramatic shift from where we were at the beginning of 2009. You know, when I first got a public platform after the auction and was talking about civil disobedience, professional environmentalists hated me. They looked at me like I was a turd in the punch bowl because I was undermining their theory of change. And, you know, like people would pull me aside and say, hey, you can't be saying all that stuff. You know, we've worked so hard to develop these relationships with corporations, you know, and like we've got this seat at the table, you know, and we're running with this cap and trade bill and stuff like that. And, you know, that theory of change really fell on its face in 2009. And so we've seen dramatic shifts in the climate movement since then. And, you know, now instead of reaching out to corporate allies, we're reaching out to social justice organizations. And so Peaceful Uprising continues to try to lead that shift. And they're also continually working on campaigns in Utah with their local organizing. They're trying to fight off the first tar sands mine in the country that's been permitted for eastern Utah. They're also doing grassroots organizing, door-to-door canvassing around the refineries in the poor neighborhoods of Salt Lake City. You know, so they're continually sort of testing the boundaries with both community organizing and social movement activism.
Great, thank you so much. Hello. With regards to the whole auction, if you had a chance, would you have done anything different?
No. You know, I think it worked out the way that it needed to work out. And when I went into it, I had very much a direct action sort of mindset of thinking about protecting that land and keeping that oil in the ground. And that was largely successful. You know, and I also realized the negative consequences that I'd be facing. You know, sitting there in the auction, I expected that I'd be going to prison for a couple years. And that turned out to be not as bad as I expected, as I've said. So the positive impacts that I expected happened, and the negative impacts that I expected weren't as bad. But then there was this whole other side to it that I didn't really anticipate, which is the symbolic impact of my actions, what it meant to the rest of the climate movement, what it meant to other people that were watching and were concerned about, you know, the gradual loss of people power in our society, and the way the corporations are dominating our government. You know, I think what it meant to people like that perhaps turned out to be more powerful than even the direct impacts. So I'd certainly do it again because it's been more positive than I could have expected.
Your experiences prove that what is right and just does not matter from a legal perspective. Do you believe that there's any hope to be had in the fight for anti-fracking legislation?
I mean, I do think that there is hope in the anti-fracking campaigns because, you know, there's a reason that has been part of the fastest growing part of the climate movement over the past few years. You know, they've really gained a lot of momentum from an issue that was completely off the radar just 5 years ago. You know, it's really became a big thing, and part of that is that it's directly impacting a broad community of people that's never felt the impacts to this sort of thing before. You know, there was a great scene in Gasland 2 where he was interviewing a Texas official who said, you know, our energy development has been destroying the lives of brown people and black people and even poor white people for hundreds of years, and nobody's really cared. And the difference now is that we're going into the backyards of middle-class white people who aren't used to getting exploited, and they're getting pissed off. You know, so it's awakening a class of people who have largely been asleep as corporations have exploited people less fortunate and privileged than themselves. And I think that's going to continue to have a bigger and bigger backlash, you know, and I think that's part of what we're experiencing with extreme energy extraction in general, you know, as we've sort of passed the peak of easy oil. You know, 5-10 years ago, everybody was talking about peak oil and wondering what's going to happen when we reach the peak of the amount of the light sweet crude oil that is easy to get to. Are we going to have this like energy crisis and that sort of thing? It turns out that that once we reach that peak, we're just going to keep going and go after all the hard to get to and dangerous stuff. The stuff that's under 2 miles of water and 1 mile of continental shelf out in the Gulf that we can't even handle when it breaks. We're going to go after the stuff in the Arctic that they still haven't been able to actually drill for, even though they've tried the last 2 summers, because they can't handle the conditions up there. We're going to go into the backyards of middle-class white people, that have never had to deal with this sort of thing before. We're going to go into the watershed of New York City. So we've reached a point of desperation where our energy economy can't continue on its trajectory in a way that's out of sight and out of mind for most Americans anymore. Now it's getting personal, and it's impacting a much broader range of society, which is creating a new kind of solidarity between groups that previously had been pitted against each other. Those in power have largely maintained their power by keeping the masses fighting amongst each other. Pitting the middle class against the working class, pitting them against the poor. Everybody fighting for the little scraps that they've had. And as everybody is now in the path of extreme energy extraction, I think there's the opportunity for a much greater solidarity of realizing our shared power to overthrow that tiny minority that's exploiting the rest of us.
Outside of the peaceful uprising, what do you do?
Well, now I'm a student at Harvard Divinity School, working on a Master's of Divinity. I'm still involved with some activist campaigns here and there, but Divinity School is certainly sucking up most of my time. So I'll be there for another 2 years, and hopefully after that we'll be a Unitarian Universalist minister, but I'm not sure exactly where I'm going to end up with that.
Okay. So I really liked what you said about your actions finally matching the magnitude of the situation, and that gave you relief. But for people who are anxious like that want to do more than a day-to-day type thing, using reusable bottles, things like that, but can't or aren't necessarily in a position to do what you did, what are some ways that they can be active and let the government know what their demands are when writing letters and making phone calls just isn't enough?
Well, I think everybody is in some position of influence. Whether that is through their job, through their school, through their local government, whatever it may be, through being a shareholder, through being connected to an institution that has an endowment. And so there's leverage points that we can exercise as members of these different communities. But it can also be just who we are as individuals, as family members, as community members, connected to a community that we might not realize beforehand. Like that's been part of the thing that I've realized through this experience. I went into it thinking, okay, there'll be a handful of people that I know will support me through this. And it turns out that there was this much larger community just waiting for something like this to happen. And I sort of like stepped off this ledge and found that there's this huge community of people there ready to support me and ready to get engaged. And some of it just comes from from our individual character, that we have power through who we are, by connecting with our stories to others. A lot of the people that were most committed in Peaceful Uprising during the time leading up to my trial, the people who were putting in a lot of work weren't climate activists beforehand. They weren't people that were already engaged in this kind of activism. A lot of the people that were most committed and doing some of the boldest actions were women around my mother's age, who I reminded them of their son, and they knew that I was in trouble. Like I was legitimately in over my head, and I actually needed their help. And so seeing someone like me in that vulnerable position engaged them, and then they started exercising their power that they had in all the communities that they were a part of. And most of them, are now still a big part of Peaceful Uprising and continuing being climate activists. But it was that engagement through somebody that reminded them of their son that pushed them into that position of power. And so every one of us has a unique set of connections like that we might not even see. But through our unique character, there's power to engage different communities through that character. But part of the power of engaging those is exposing ourselves in a vulnerable way. There's a lot of power that lies in that vulnerability because of those connections that we have, and the way that people are powerfully motivated when they see someone in a vulnerable position.
All right. What advice would you suggest to students who are interested in joining a peaceful uprising or protest? Is there anything that you think they should take into account beforehand?
Yeah, Peaceful Uprising is pretty much a local group in Utah. There are similar groups across the country, frontline grassroots community organizations. Whether they're fighting fracking or mountaintop removal or pipelines or things like that. There's a lot of those groups to reach out and engage with. I think one of the important things to keep in mind is that with as much experience as some of the people in those organizations might have, none of them have ever solved a climate crisis before. None of them know how to do that. So they might have experience with things that have worked to some degree and a lot of things that haven't worked at all, and they can share some of that. But in a rapidly changing and chaotic world, that may or may not be true in the future of whether or not that kind of thing is going to work or not. And we're probably going to need new and creative solutions. Old people often tell young people that, oh, you just don't understand how change works, which may or may not be true. But we know that baby boomers don't know how change works, at least not progressives anyway, because they failed to get it done during the whole time that their generation has been in power. Most of the things that we care about our society have gone backwards during that time. That if baby boomers knew how to solve the climate crisis, they'd have done it before any of you were born, because they've known about this crisis longer than you've been alive, and yet haven't had an adequate response to it. So I think it's important to remember that we need to bring our own initiative and our own creativity and our own ideas into this and try new things. We don't need young people in the movement to be doing what old people tell them to do. We need new ideas and new initiative, and people taking chances and taking risks.
Where did you get the idea to use Craigslist to find a congressional candidate? That was interesting. And although this was unsuccessful in terms of winning the office, do you think there was a gain in making people change the way they think about campaigns?
Well, the idea for the Craigslist campaign It happened late at night, in some degree of frustration. Um, at that point, we had spent a lot of effort lobbying our congressman um, around the climate bill that year, and he not only refused to deal with us, he actually hid from us and hid from the public view. So we realized we needed to get rid of him, and so we were trying to recruit a progressive candidate to run against him. But all the established progressive politicians in Utah refused to run against him, not because they agreed with him, but because they were afraid of his mother. Because he came from a political dynasty in Utah, and his mother was one of the power brokers in the Utah Democratic Party. And so, I mean, I had a former Senate candidate tell me that he was afraid of this guy's mother. And, so we were frustrated with that. And there was a group of us that were talking about, how to deal with this congressman, and sort of how to create the larger political shift that we needed, which was getting people to understand the power that we have in this system, getting people to exercise that power of shifting the way we look at our representatives, where we're not going to them and bowing down and saying, oh, can you please do this? Oh, well, if you can't do that, can we get a partial solution? Can we just get these crumbs pushed our way? To realize that those people work for us, that we as citizens are the boss of our politicians, that we should look at it like we're hiring them to work for us, and if they're not working for them, we fire. If they're not working for us, we fire them. So it was in that discussion of, how do we remind people of this, that we're supposed to be hiring somebody to work for us in Washington, that the Help Wanted ad came out. That I said, well, if we were bosses hiring somebody, we'd put out a Help Wanted ad. And I didn't want to do it on any of the paid sites, so I used Craigslist, sort of just to get this point out there. But then it actually started getting attention. It started getting media attention. People were interested in it, and it started getting applicants. And I said, we might as well run with it. It's as good of a plan as we've got right now. And it did end up becoming a serious campaign then. It split the delegate vote at the state convention, which forced a runoff primary, and then Jim Matheson, the incumbent, dropped about $1.2 million on that primary, and so he blew us out of the water pretty well at that point. But it did engage all these people in politics who had never been involved in politics before, and it did start to shift people's thinking about how to engage with our political system. And I think we need a lot more of that. Especially on the left, we have no creative thinking when it comes to electoral politics. Even in sources and media outlets like The Nation and The Progressive and things like that have really good critical thinking on so many issues and challenge so much conventional wisdom. When it comes to electoral politics, they just say this is the way that it's done and this is the way it's got to be, and we shouldn't question that. The only two serious approaches that progressives have taken in recent decades to electoral politics is voting for the lesser of two evils or not voting. And both of those have proven to be disastrous. Both of those are complete failures at actually leading to real progressive change. But I think that those represent a rather small part of the spectrum of possibilities with how to engage with our political system. I think there's a lot more creative opportunities out there, and we need to explore them. We need to be willing to experiment with new ways of engaging with our political system that go beyond either not voting or voting for the lesser of two evils.
Hi. Doing great. So we have about 3 minutes left on our memory card, so we're going to
Who has been an inspiration for you in terms of becoming an activist? And has that changed at all post auction?
My mother was always a big influence on me growing up. She was an activist fighting the coal companies in the early days of mountaintop removal when I was growing up in West Virginia. And there are a lot of historical inspirations that I've had. The most salient for me was probably Alice Paul in the women's suffrage movement. She was somebody who came along at a time when the suffrage movement had spent a few decades being very polite, doing a lot of education, but sort of begging for their rights, and even using self-demeaning arguments in order to beg for their rights. And so they'd build up this mass of folks in the middle that were lukewarm supporters, but they weren't actually winning any tangible changes. And she came along and said, rather than begging for our rights, we ought to be demanding our rights. She started leading some confrontational actions, and shocking a lot of people, but disrupting that easy, lukewarm middle ground, where people could say, oh yeah, women should have some more rights one day, we'll get there, but really forcing people into a choice of either giving women their rights right now or continuing the oppression and violence against women. And she forced the nation into the choice, and they came down on the side of giving them their rights. And I think the climate movement is at a similar position, where we've built up a lot of lukewarm, comfortable support, and I think it's time we force the country into a choice between either really defending a livable future for young people, or continuing to condemn us to an unlivable world.